So,
Recording in progress now.
Okay.
You don't want to get pulled before the Open Meetings Commission asking why you didn't record it.
right, right.
And I believe these recordings are now going up on the MDE site as well.
Correct. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 o'clock, so why don't we get the meeting started? So thanks for joining, and looking forward to today's conversation. So David circulated a version of the agenda. I'm gonna plop it on the chat just for everyone to have visible, but essentially we'll let me put this there we go. Oh, and let me add, since we're going to be talking about the methane recommendation as the first item, let me drop the verbatim version of that recommendation so we have it also handy. There we go. So welcome to our February meeting. We have an interesting agenda today. We're going to be looking at the methane recommendation, and we've asked our dear colleague Ross Dickerson to lead that part of the discussion while he walks through the AOSC hallways in the campus, which I recognize. So Ross, we'll give you time to get to your desk and
we can go by your old office if you want, if it makes you feel homesick.
Then, over the past few weeks, we had an interesting exchange about energy generation, green ammonia, from green ammonia to coal to other solar to other sources. So we thought that we could have a little bit of a catch-up conversation around that topic. And then I want to touch base on a conversation that we actually started in the last meeting of last year around our priorities for 2025 and some ideas around that. And we have a working draft that we've shared with MDE, with MCCC. But I hope we can have a little bit of a conversation in terms of kind of setting up a little, something like a work plan that goes beyond the year in a way, right? And there's plenty of past experiences that this group or the SWG has generated in the past that we could take as experiences moving forward. So I was hoping to talk a little bit about that, and I'll moderate that part of the conversation. So, and then we have some public comment, some space will come public comment. So that's a little bit of the plan. So maybe just let's jump into the first topic. And I don't know, is it Dave or Russ directly that we can get this going?
I'll just mention, just for Russ's edification as well, and to let everyone know, during the 2024 MCCC meeting, there was some questions about the methane recommendation that we had written, and ultimately it was pulled because they wanted to make sure that we had more communications and stakeholder engagement with the impacted communities. That's my recollection of it. We, as you'll recall, throughout 24, we had a lot of different presenters come in talking about methane, including Stephanie Lansing, who's with us here today at Russ's request. And Russ, so I also put out an email to MDA. Their person who would be is on vacation today, and I'm hoping to set up a separate meeting with them that would include perhaps you and Stephanie in that conversation if you'd like.
Yeah, and I just was in a meeting with Kevin Addix from NDA, and we spoke about this briefly because we were both in the meeting early. So we actually had a conversation about it just
Okay.
an hour ago.
Okay, and I was working with Hans Schmidt, the assistant secretary. So thank you.
Okay. Yeah, my recollection is just that he said this is as written, it's economically unfeasible and dangerous, and you should have talked to me first. And so we just set it aside for the moment. And that was these total commission meetings are very tight on time, and there wasn't opportunity to discuss it further. But I know, Stephanie, you and he work together, so there must be some common ground that those of us who are not cow savvy um,
Yeah, so talking to
can
Kevin,
understand.
we actually just had, I was in Annapolis yesterday for a bill hearing on anaerobic digestion. And there was, it was for procurement purposes and anaerobic digestion with state agencies. And there was a lot of the agencies present and a lot of conversation with the senators because it was a Senate bill hearing. And I think the general consensus is that, you know, abating methane is really important, but this is the first time I've seen this recommendation actually. And I think adding on the dairy and wood waste sites is really limiting where we need to be with this recommendation. So if you look at, for example, California, they have $19 million funds for just food waste digestion and 17 million for dairy digestion. But their dairy industry is much bigger than our dairy industry, right? So that makes sense when you look at the whole state and what their state emissions are. Dairy is a large part of state emissions. And so putting that $17 million makes sense. But then they also have an equal amount for food waste and digestion of food waste to reduce landfill mitigations. And so that's just looking at another state. So for us, I think pointing out dairy in a state that we do have dairies, don't get me wrong, but it's not like that's our leading agricultural production industry. It may be in digesters, we can do them on dairies right now. I mean, we can cover them as we speak, and we'd have the technology for it. We have the know-how, we can do it. So I understand the calling out of the dairies, but I don't know if we really need to do that. I don't think we need to. I just think develop mechanism to incentivize composting anaerobic digesters, and digesters is with an E, and then period. I don't think there needs to be a targeting.
I agree with not having the targeting, but I would also like to see added to it and technologies to prevent methane emissions in general. I mean, that's one approach, but there's other ways of doing it, and I fully support what you've been doing in that regard. But I don't want to limit it either on the source or the approach to limiting those methane emissions.
Good
Maybe.
point. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe the targeting or the such as incentivize composting, anaerobic digestion, and other technologies that limit methane emissions, something
Right.
like that.
Yeah. Sure. I mean, a lot of landfills now emit a lot of methane, and some of them collect the methane and then just flare it, even within the state of Maryland. This is heartbreaking and should stop. It's a useful resource. Why wouldn't we turn it into electricity or heat or something, or ethanol
chemicals.
or benzene or whatever it is Eric wants to turn it into?
Bioplastic.
I want to turn it into a valuable product so there's a financial incentive to capture it.
Right.
That's the main thing.
Yeah, something other than just heating the outside air,
Right.
which is what's going on now. I mean, it's better to burn it than let it sneak out as methane, but that's still a bad thing.
And from talking to Secretary Addix this morning, he says that, from MDA's perspective, that they are in favor of kind of the general language of doing things to reduce methane emissions and technologies that help reduce those methanes. So he said, yeah, we're in favor of that. He said that the thing about the cost competitiveness and things like that, he was, he's like, we can work, those things seem to me, that's not a reason to not invest and to not move forward. The idea is to incentivize. So I think it's, MDA he's in favor of technologies that reduce methane in general, including digesters.
So Stephanie, no good deed goes unpunished. So perhaps you can pen a couple of sentences for us that would be a palatable recommendation that would help reduce methane emissions and wouldn't annoy the farmers.
I guess my question is I guess one of the things that I'm a little I'm a little confused about the way it's written now, because again, I didn't have anything to do with the wordsmithing here, is reduce nutrient inputs to the check to be paid to avoid methane emissions. I'm just unclear if the part of nutrients coming in there, because I don't know if those are always linked,
Stephanie,
because you have food waste going to landfills and that's not necessarily connected to a nutrient. And so I think creating that linkage maybe is a little confusing.
Stephanie, this came out of a series of presentations and discussions we had with the general issue being where are we getting emissions of things other than CO2, like methane, NOx, and nitrous oxide, and so on, that are coming from other activities other than burning fuel and that sort of thing. So we heard presentations on agricultural sources. My recollection is that whoever made the presentation, I forget who did, but basically compared them and said in Maryland, the agricultural sources are primarily from dairy.
That was my presentation, and it is definitely dairy. So even though dairies is a small industry, they have much larger of an impact than our poultry.
I'm just trying to help you understand how. And then the other thing, we heard a presentation on the generation of methane from the bay.
Okay.
Methane is being vented out of the bay primarily because it's overloaded with nutrients and it has, anoxic processes going on.
Right.
So that's the two parts that got emphasized, because that's what we heard.
Okay. That makes sense.
And so maybe it takes a little bit more explanation to understand how methane is resulting from excessive nutrient application, but it is. And then secondly, I would just say I think we do need to work on this wording and broaden it. But I mean, if you don't mention anything about targets, then you're not, the recommendation is hardly useful. So I think we have to maybe give a list as well as the general comment of ways that we could reduce these methane emissions coming from other activities other than fossil fuel use.
Yeah, so if you look at California, I mean, their two targets are dairy and food waste, wasted food. And so I think to me, those would be better targets than the industrial scale wood waste sites. I'm not sure where that came from.
Food, that should be food waste, right?
Yeah, I believe the compost
food waste.
Food waste,
not wood waste. No.
Oh, well, then we're already pointing out food. And to me, already pointing out food is, but I would just not even put industrial scale. I would just say targeted at dairy farms and wasted food.
Yeah, we had a separate recommendation about wood waste. Somehow they got conflated. There are two important concepts here. They're separated with a period, but maybe they should be different recommendations. Yeah, one is, as Don said, the ammonia and oxidized nitrogen that gets into the bay causes it to go anaerobic and it releases methane. Full stop. New topic is manure, which is I don't like to call waste. It's a useful fertilizer, and if you do it right, you can use the methane. But related to that is food waste. That can be composted and turned into fertilizer. So maybe these should be separate recommendations to avoid confusion, but I think they're related and they're both useful recommendations. I think I heard Don say we should put numbers on it. That's going to require some work.
Well, I didn't say numbers. I just said, we ought to just, rather than saying we ought to reduce methane emissions, non-combustion methane emissions, full stop. It doesn't tell you very much. I would say, including the following, without being quantitative, because I don't know that we can be quantitative.
Adele.
Yes, I just have a note regarding so dairy. The data that I have looked at, dairy is about 8.1% of the commodity in Maryland. About 47.1 is poultry, and about 4.1 it is cattle. So when you add these sort of animals together, and by the way, poultry manure is the nation's third largest source of methane from livestock. So meaning even though, dairy is small, yes, we are definitely small compared to other states, such as California, as Stephanie appropriately pointed out. But we have, for our state, for size of our state, we have poultry, we have the dairy, we have the cattle. So dairy and cattle together, it's about what, almost 13%, 14%. And then poultry is about 47 in terms of commodity, that agricultural, in other words, sector. So those are things that we need to
Sorry,
keep in mind.
did you say that the poultry generates methane? Or
Yes, that's what I'm reading. Actually, I just Googled because I didn't know. I Googled. I have to look at if there is any scholarly, data. But it says poultry manure is the nation's third largest source of methane from livestock manure management.
Yeah, so we actually have a USDA Smart Commodities grant on exactly that, the amount of methane coming from poultry litter storage.
Yeah.
Because it's often said it's zero, but it's not. And so we're actually looking at that right now, as long as our funding doesn't get removed. But we're in the first year of a 4-year grant on that.
So we need to be careful to downplay it without really looking at it a little bit further. That's what my point is, in other words.
Okay, that's good to know. We better get that straight. How much? I mean, I guess it probably depends on how you handle the manure. It has to be anaerobic to make methane.
Yeah, I mean, you can just say livestock and poultry. You can say something that's a little bit bigger, but dairy is definitely the biggest contributor, even though it's a small industry. When you add up all of because you get more of it, but we just have a lot more poultry litter. So even though it's smaller amount of methane emissions, it's still emissions. So
yeah, it's a much bigger chunk of our economy. Yeah. Okay, I guess we better do a little homework.
David?
Yeah. Oh, David Vanko, go ahead. I was just going to say thanks, Stephanie. You've really earned your stripes on this. And feel free, I think maybe between me, you, and Russ, we could work on kind of redrafting this a bit, as discussed, and then bring it back to this group for the next meeting.
I just quickly did a revision in chat, which I think captures pretty much everything we just said.
Oh, great.
Oh, there we go.
Grab it, David, work on it.
Just so I'm aware, because I don't really know the timeline for this group and what things like, when do we have to turn that around, and can you change it?
Yeah, yes, for the 2025 report, which will be due in the fall.
Okay.
So what we wanted to do is not lose this one from the 2024 recommendation list, and only work on it later in the year, because then no one would have remembered, except perhaps for Don, what was said last year throughout all the sessions that we had. So it's really helpful just to kind of turn this around quickly. And Eric put up some potential language. I'm going to just save it in a different file so it doesn't get lost here, and then we could take another look at it after we consider different things and really check in with MDA again on this, and maybe bring it back to the next STWG meeting, and perhaps try to wrap up this recommendation, and or even still talk to other stakeholder groups that we may need to, as per recommended by MDA.
Okay. A quick question for the water quality people. My understanding is that in terms of eutrophication, reduced and oxidized nitrogen, that is ammonia versus NOx or nitric acid, are both equally bad for generating eutrophication. But does phosphorus play any role, or is it all nitrogen in the Chesapeake Bay?
In terms of eutrophication, it's both. But nitrogen tends to have a bit of a larger overall impact, but it's both. You need two to tango. They need both nutrients.
Okay, maybe we can be a little more specific then.
And if I could just add, I never go against anything Dr. Bosch says, but when we're talking upstream in the rivers, phosphorus can be more impactful. So we don't, the river keepers get sensitive when we wholly focus on nitrogen. So just adding that.
Okay, good. Yeah, it's a fresh water versus brackish water thing, which one dominates, I guess. But we don't have to get into the, no pun intended, weeds. But maybe we can be specific about those three, because I think those are the most important nutrients, right? Nothing else really is a major player.
Also, we need to keep in mind that from drainage point of view, nitrogen in the form of nitrate is more mobile, so that's always, more sort of contributor in terms of water contamination. And phosphorus, yes, it is moving some soluble, but some definitely particulate form, and all the legacy phosphorus that has been a lots of discussion on it from the Chesapeake Bay sediments. So as Dom mentioned, and and that is, as you said, I won't go against Dom, but both nitrogen and phosphorus cause eutrophication. But again, nitrogen is more mobile, and that has always been sort of a priority, sort of to tackle. That doesn't mean that phosphorus is not, and they both cause the eutrophication.
The key is which is the limiting nutrient in each ecosystem.
Right.
Well, that too, but also if we're talking about hypoxia, anoxia in the bay, in the estuary rather than in the rivers, the science shows that what's driving that is nitrogen loads primarily, not exclusively, but primarily.
Okay, right. And and the two major sources of nitrogen are oxidized nitrogen from combustion and reduced nitrogen, mostly, but not exclusively, from agriculture.
And waste, human waste.
And, well, yeah, okay, biogenic, right.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, I think we can.
So Fernando, just the thought and hearing this, I mean, I think we need to be, this is a lesson learned. We need to be more thoughtful how we compose these and talk to people like MDA and so on.
Yes.
But on the other hand, I wonder about whether STWG has the capacity or the responsibility of stakeholder consultation. I mean, we can talk to every farmer or the Farm Bureau or whatever, that's other agencies we work with do those things. So I think you have to kind of manage expectations as well as our degree of effort in terms of.
Yeah. No, and that's a good point, because so when we presented all recommendations, not just the methane and others, but the question that kept coming up at the commission level was, have stakeholders been consulted? Have you engaged with stakeholders in doing this? So
that was with all, yeah. That was with all 8 work groups. Everyone's recommendations went through that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
it's a problem for the commission, but I don't think you can expect a scientific advisory group to do all the stakeholder outreach and consultation for the whole commission.
Well, probably. I mean, one way to think about it is whether this is responsibility or scope of the STWG. The other, maybe a smarter tack is to say, well, this needs to happen, right? We have identified this needs to happen, and consult within the commission as to how this can actually be accomplished.
If I may, my question for the committee, the commission, that whoever raised that question, stakeholder, Hans, my friend Hans Schmidt, and that is that Hans is there, right? But anyway, my question would be, though, what questions are we asking the stakeholders? Number one, how are you managing, for example, dairy or poultry waste? Do you have any management practices that you are doing? All I'm saying, we have some of those in the books. But my point is, and the stakeholder from the point of view that, okay, do you agree with this recommendation? If it is quantitative, or if we are posing some practices in there, then they won't know they're not measuring it. But again, it will be more related to how they view, how they do the management that can help on this sort of recommendation, or how they view the recommendation. Well, that can go all over. In other words, well, we are doing what we can do, which has been always, and I know that they do hard to implement some of the best management practices. But anyway, that's really the way that I would also discuss, to see really exactly what aspect they want stakeholders to be involved with.
Correct. Yeah, I think this is an item in general that we can raise at the commission level to try to understand what's the expectation and because this is going to apply to all recommendations and certainly maybe some of the groups may have a more natural connection for that being part of their scope, but certainly we don't appear to at least understand it that clearly at this point. Okay. All right. Anything else regarding methane? All right.
Okay, I'd just putting a few tweaks into Eric's comments, and we're talking about agriculture, and is it wastewater where most of the reduced nitrogen comes from after agriculture? So I think in order of priority, it is now reduced nitrogen is more than oxidized nitrogen, and that appears to be in general more important than phosphorus. So I just want to put them in the right order. Is it wastewater or just the word waste?
It's just waste. Wastewater is flowing to Chesapeake, which goes to the first sentence. Waste has to do with industrial waste, like food, like landfill, things of that nature, which are more solid, which then result in methane gas coming off.
In the bay, yeah. Okay.
Well, no, just
from the
land.
Well, that's a separate issue. I want to have two now, one for the bay and one for
right. So the first
there
sentence dealt with the bay, and the second sentence dealt with agriculture and waste.
Yes, and I want to separate those because it drove people a little crazy. Even Stephanie.
So when you're talking about the nitrogen input, you're talking about wastewater, but again, that is broadly because that can be a wastewater treatment plant, that can be a septic tank, that can be a lot of sources. So you don't want to. It's not necessarily wastewater treatment plant, right? But it is wastewater.
I just said wastewater. I didn't say wastewater treatment plant. So you're happy with that? Okay. And then the separate one, is agricultural industrial waste. Yeah. And municipal, I suppose.
Yeah. And then Suzanne talked about stormwater. Yeah, we do get nitrates in the stormwater from runoff from fertilizer, usually in lawns, but not always. But you do have that.
Yeah, that's a component, right? Okay. I'll stick it into the chat if we can.
Yes, we'll pick it up.
And you can move on.
All right. All right. Well, thank you. Then on the next item, so over the past probably few weeks or maybe since the year started, the beginning of the year is a little fuzzy, but a few weeks after the new year started, we started having an exchange over email that got very lively about proposed legislation related to energy generation, and so I wanted to have this forum at least touch base on that item. And is this an item that we would focus, or at least part of our work during this year? That's a little bit of my my question, in general, but certainly talking about specifically, what are our sources for power generation?
And I'll add, it was a very lively conversation and a lot of things were put in there. And I know some of you, followed it really, really closely, and others probably jumped in and out of the conversation when they had time. There are a bunch of energy-related bills in this year's session. I don't think any of us are necessarily prepared to want to represent those bills or summarize those bills. And it's also worth mentioning, and this kind of gets back to how this group could interact with other groups related to recommendations. There are, a few other work groups that really focus on energy generation issues. And the question comes up of how much should we be involved in it, or how much should we try to help support their conversations? I don't have a ready answer for that. And so we should discuss it is kind of the point. Yeah.
Yeah, I think first of all, the legislation that's being considered in Annapolis now you only got what, Suzanne, 5 weeks or something like that to go before. So we're not going to, and it's not our job and our responsibility to represent science before the General Assembly. We advise the commission. So I don't think we can have any meaningful effect on that. But I think in the long run, however it comes out during this session, the issue before us is, how will Maryland, having made this commitment in law that we're going to, reduce our emissions ultimately to net zero, and now we have a plan that's taken a couple of years to develop to tell us how to do that, and then all of a sudden there's panic because the price of energy goes up, and you say, "Oops, we have a shortage of supply," and all of a sudden you say, "Oh, well, maybe we didn't mean." No fossil fuel and a generation of power, as we said before, and we're going to add it in. That's a broader conversation the commission has to have, I think, and, with respect to how do we manage this in the future, whatever the legislature does. But having said that, there are a number of things that come out of this legislation that I think requires some technical scientific advice, and that was included in our free-ranging discussion, which I felt I should have paid tuition for, because I learned a lot in the process. And they are things like hydrogen, because it says, oh, okay, we can have natural gas plants as long as they can be converted to hydrogen for a fuel, or biofuels. Well, have you thought that through? Is that really feasible, or is that a smart thing to do? And that's going to take some time. It's not going to happen next year. But I think those are the kinds of issues that I think we could maybe advise the commission on as we think about these challenges in the future. How do we these other forms of energy that are non-hydrocarbons, how can they be used in this transition that we're trying to effect? I mean, that's my takeaway from the discussion.
I hate to do this. I have a lot that I could say on this particular topic, but I have another meeting that started at 1:30 and I have to drop off. So if it's possible to come back to this at some time, I'd be love to just go into full details.
Absolutely.
Great.
I got to go.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric.
Sure.
So I don't know whether this has been on, maybe Suzanne knows, is this on the radar of the commission beyond what's happening in the legislature, or?
Yeah, yes. Obviously energy is a big issue in the press. The high rates people are reacting to and connecting to climate policy. Whether we don't think that the data supports that conclusion. So I think this body, particularly reacting to the specifics of proposed legislation or enacted legislation. And again, I'm going to throw out the word innovation. What aren't our legislators and our policymakers thinking about that they should? And to me, the innovation comes in, there's a lot of conversation about small modular nuclear, particularly in connection with data centers. What does the public need to know about that? What are the safety? What are the concerns? What are the opportunities and risks associated with it? How can we provide facts to a lot of the fiction that's out there? And so some of that is, Don, as you suggested, like, can these really be converted, or is that just speculation or an excuse to move forward with old technology? But what are the innovative areas that offer real solutions, practical outcomes that the state should be looking hard at? And I think some of that innovation comes in the combination of different technologies. And so what are those combinations? So help policymakers really focus on practical solutions.
Good. I put something into the chat that looks good. I confess I haven't read more than the summary from the National Academy on advanced reactors, next generation. So I think I need to do my homework.
Another one of those areas of innovation I would submit, in addition to, we had a good discussion with Jonah and Eric and so on about uses of hydrogen and how should we be thinking about that and that sort of thing. I think that's a fruitful area. But another area, just following the debates on this, is storage. If we're going to go, we're going to have more renewable energy. The storage issue is a huge issue, and I think we have some capability, some understanding within the science and technical community in Maryland that we can tap to help us think through that in the mix of how we develop this mix of the energy that we need in the transition to meet our goals.
Jonah's hand is raised.
So since hydrogen was brought up, I thought I'd chime in, and I think that what I'd like to emphasize is what we want to do is be a little bit more agnostic about where the energy comes from and keep a focus on emissions being the main problem. And even if ultimately the energy is coming from hydrogen extracted from fossil fuels, as long as it's CO2 or emissions generally free, then it's something that we should at least consider as part of our discussion. The other technical thing that I think that we haven't actually spent enough time talking about as a group is emissions associated with transportation, and a lot of the technologies that could be brought up with that. Transportation is, I've been looking at this a little more carefully, still the single largest emission source within the state of Maryland. We barely give it any shrift at all. And as we move to more EV based transportation, we will have to expand our generating facility. So all of these conversations associated with the increase in the electrical capacity of the state are wrapped up in all of this. So as a task for us, I think that we should maybe think about that a little bit more than we have.
And I think we have to build a better bridge to the mitigation work group that is looking very seriously at the various emissions from a variety of different sources, not only power plants, but, vehicles and so forth, and understand, how we may be able to help or have input on what they're working on in an efficient and effective manner.
Especially since there are so many new technologies that could potentially help address that they might not be aware of.
Right.
Do we know of the scope of the mitigation group? Is it more policy? Is it more, is there is there an opportunity to really infuse science and technology into that conversation?
Suzanne has a hand up.
Yeah, Suzanne, I think you're the best person to answer that. You probably go to those meetings as well.
Not as often as I'd like, especially during session. So, but yes, and recall, the guidepost, the roadmap is the University of Maryland Center for Global Sustainability's Pathways report that lines up all the policies. And again, I admit that the ground has shifted since that was published with the addition of data centers. But that there is a strategy, there is a set of policies that the state, MDE, MEA, MDOT are working tightly together around transportation. We are a part of RGGI, which is a cap and invest program for power generation. So whatever power generation occurs in Maryland is going to be required to meet RGGI requirements, which they're working on the net zero date. It's somewhere between 2040 and 2045, 2050. I don't know where it'll end up, but there's a net zero date for power generation in RGGI states, of which we're an active member. So we have the power strategy and policy. We have the transportation policy and strategy. And I recognize that the landscape has shifted. So again, this is where looking at how the addition of the federal administration and their policy changes, which impacts significantly our success or probability of success, number one. And number two, the addition of more expensive energy, which impacts public opinion, as well as greater demand from data centers. Hope that's helpful.
It is, and we received a suggestion in the chat by Jeff Silva to include also the Energy Resilience and Efficiency Working Group, which I assume there's intersections there as well. Good.
To that end, I mean, I could reach out to the two co-chairs of the mitigation work group in particular, and get a better sense of their work plan and how perhaps some of the expertise on the STWG could, sit in on some of their meetings, when relevant, and I could help coordinate that.
And Dave, Mark Stewart is here. He can speak to the newer working groups and connect you there as well, Mark, if you want to chime in.
Well, this is a really timely conversation. Hi, everyone. The Mitigation Working Group Steering Committee is meeting with the lead on the two new energy-related working groups of the Climate Commission in about 2 weeks from now to look at these intersectional issues. There's a lot of focus on energy generation. The Mitigation Working Group co-chairs are very interested in having the MWG have an appropriate place in that discussion and think about policy recommendations, but of course without duplicating efforts and stepping on the toes of the existing energy working groups. So in a couple of weeks from now, we're going to map that out, and we can, I think, fold into that conversation, thinking about the landscape of issues related to our energy system, our electricity system, and where there might be pieces that really are best situated with the STWG. So I'll keep that in my mindset as we go into that meeting in a couple of weeks.
Now, is there a suggested way to accelerate the connection of this working group with that? Can we hear in that meeting, or I'm just trying to find a way to accelerate that connection.
Yeah, I have no problem. Anyone who on your side who would want to be in that meeting, we're happy to include you in that.
Well, Mark, why don't, if you don't mind, sending an invite to Fernando and I, and we could discuss how we might be able to who could cover it. And at least the meeting with the different chairs, and then we could, get a little bit better on the landscape of how to move forward.
Yeah, sounds good. Can do.
Thanks.
Yeah, we have Adele and then Stephanie.
Yes, I was just wondering, this is not the area that I have done research, but I'm wondering, all these groups that are working, maybe Dave or anybody, you all know it, do we have a sort of database, on each of these sort of power generation technologies or methods, number one, and number two, do we also have similarly data on the potential emissions of each one of these methods? If we had the database, then that could be a project, but delve into it and see, how much can be generated by each method and prioritize them, and based on the emissions or whatever we are trying to prioritize. So to optimize, in order to find the optimum sort of technology, that innovation that will actually satisfy the energy needs at the same time, not violate our net zero pathway. So, I'm just sort of wondering about database. Always, that's really starting point for me. Yeah.
Great. Stephanie?
This is a technical working group, so I think you should stick to the technical stuff. But if you're interested in the political things, I actually had to testify yesterday in Annapolis for a bill that came later. But the very first bill that they were talking about was the Empowering New Energy Resources and Green Initiatives Towards a Zero Emissions, called Energize Maryland Act. So it was Paul Pinsky talking about that act. And so if you're interested, it was a very long conversation, but they record all of those testimonies. So if you are interested in learning where the Maryland Energy Administration is on kind of how they're going towards zero emission, you can listen to that very long testimony, but it was interesting. I put it in the chat.
Thank you.
I think Don and then Jonah.
Yeah, this to Adele's point, Adele, I think that this idea of emissions per different energy generation approach was included in the analysis that the Global Center did, and that's now part of the Maryland plan. So that's in there at some level now. Whether there needs to be refinement or not, it's another matter. But it struck me that there are two things I think I don't know enough about, and I think I'm not sure they're margin, at least on the margins, technical, that I think are part of the present debate about the response to the high energy cost. One is the grid and how that's managed. That apparently seems to be, all parties here seem to agree that there's some dysfunction of the management of that grid process, and it's surely somewhere in our universities or in our scientific community, there's some expertise that we can maybe tap on and hear about that. And the second point, I actually got from my wife, who is following the discourse about raising energy bills, and we haven't hit us yet because we have this flat, averaged over many months thing. But she's hearing from all sorts of sources that if you're not protected by that, or if you're in a new regime, rates are going really up high. And the biggest rate increases are actually in natural gas, not in electricity. So if you have BG&E, you get one bill, but it's got natural gas and electricity on it. And that is really being driven by the global market for natural gas, which in no small measure is affected by the U.S. aggressive policy for exporting natural gas, because they can get higher prices for the gas than in domestic. So that's affecting the domestic price and so on as well. So building a gas plant, a new natural gas electricity plant, if the price of gas is going up, might not get you very far. So I don't know, this is not the kind of natural science that I do, but somewhere in our universe of our colleagues, there must be some expertise we can who's knowledgeable about this and studies this that can help advise the commission as it thinks through these challenges.
Yeah, I suspect Eric and his shop will contribute to this as well.
I wanted to point out that in addition to the atmospheric emissions we're talking about, there are other byproducts. We all know that coal burning has coal ash as a byproduct. I haven't seen in the discussion about nuclear revisiting of nuclear waste. If we increase nuclear in Maryland, we'll have waste that needs to be stored temporarily, which has risks, and we'll have waste that needs to be transported off-site out of Maryland for long-term storage, because we don't have geological sites in Maryland identified as suitable for long-term storage. And I only point out that I just haven't seen this. It's an old argument, and I haven't seen it brought up recently in these new energy bills.
I wanted to just chime in to address something that Adele said about the data and emissions and energy and stuff. And I've been actually going through with a somewhat fine-tooth comb trying to actually map out the whole energy and emissions of the state just on the side. And most of the data is accessible through things like the Energy Information Agency and some of the filters through Maryland. That said, the presentation of that data is a complete mess. There's between units conversion, between even for instance, to try to find how much nuclear energy, how many megawatt hours were generated in 2022 is a half a day's chore from Calvert Cliffs, one nuclear power station. And that's because some people are reporting the energy generated, some people are reporting it from the energy content of the nuclear fuel, not taking into account the efficiency of energy conversion. So, it relates to policy, but I think it falls under our purview to discuss the data that's out there, because it's, as a science and technical working group, the databases of information are the things that is what we work with as we think about what we're doing. So I'm curious what kind of shepherding or maintenance of that kind of data is done within the state, and whether that kind of thing can be changed or improved or what. Suzanne, I guess, is about to respond.
Yeah, and I'm gonna, Mark, get ready, because I'm gonna toss it to you. But I believe that we have one of the best inventories in the nation, if not in the world, and thanks in large part to Mark Stewart and Vimal, who is on this call. So with that, Mark, I know you won't disappoint. I'm gonna toss it to you to respond.
Let me just be clear. Part of it is because there's a lot of data, which is great. I would much rather have too much data and have to sift through it than have not enough data and not know what to do.
And I think Vimal has done presentations to this group before, but honestly, when I talk to other states, when the Secretary attends the U.S. Climate Alliance, we tend to be the envy of other states, and I think, again, hats off to Mark Stewart and his team on that. Mark,
I deserve zero credit, but Vimal and his team deserve a lot. Jonah, you articulated nicely why we have a relatively well-staffed technical division within the climate change program, because the mountain of data and the different formats makes my head spin. But fortunately, Vimal's much smarter than I am, and his head is more firmly on his shoulders. So, Vimal, do you have any response to the dizzying array of data that you deal with every day?
Yeah, we're always looking up EIA data links to respond to questions like this. One thing we've done internally is made a resource of like quick links. So like I already have a link to that goes to Maryland's energy goes directly and pre-filters to Maryland's energy generation over the inventory or our goal period. If that's what you were looking for. But if there's anything else we can help with, definitely reach out directly.
Thanks. I think that I mean, I can find the data myself and I can interpret it, and certainly I would reach out to you, but I would just say, as a citizen of the state, if I were interested in delving into this kind of thing, some of the pathways that one might take to find this data is murky, if not opaque, to say the least.
We have a report. It's is it 2 years or 3 years, Mark, that we do the inventory and the status?
Every 3 years, comprehensive economy-wide GHG inventory. But that doesn't necessarily get into, I mean, I can tell you, in our inventory, I don't think you would find the specific megawatt production of Calvert Cliffs in a given year, for instance. So, there's a lot of data that we do publish, but it's not all, going to address the specific needs of stakeholders.
And I feel like I'm just a little defensive. I was not trying to be antagonistic in any way. I'm actually really impressed by all of the data and shepherding of it. It's just a lot, and it's hard. I get it.
The only thing I would add to this, first off, perhaps having Vimal, and Mark give a presentation on that database might be helpful to this group, and maybe there are some thoughts about how it could be helped. I've worked with our fisheries team, not on the data, but just in general, our fisheries scientists. And, they struggle with the same thing related to fishery catches and so forth, there's a tremendous amount of data. It doesn't always address the issue and the questions that they're hoping to address, but also sometimes, I don't know if it applies to this, sometimes the data, they may be giving it to the state, but it's somewhat proprietary data. So it's so hidden that one couldn't use it from a business standpoint against someone else. I don't know if that's the case in the energy sector, but it does sometimes cause some challenges. So maybe we could have that conversation, Mark and Vimal, if you guys are okay with that at a future meeting, to see how this is laid out.
I'll defer to Vimal because he would be the one to cover those spaces.
Yeah, sounds good. And I'll just add that we've long envisioned a public dashboard that makes these kind of activity metrics or diving deeper into the inventory more accessible. It's still something we're hoping to launch soon.
Well, thank you. So it looks like this whole topic of and I've heard, I've been jotting down a few things, energy sources versus emission, innovation. Certainly, probably more than a few of us need to get detailed eyes on the Center for Global Sustainability study in Maryland, and then these inventories on the greenhouse gases, as well as this data browser that Vimal just shared with us. So it looks like that could be packaged into more than one conversation around energy in general and emissions in Maryland. And I want to start thinking towards, I'm always trying to think of what's the product that we need to generate. At the end of the day, we're going to generate some input into the Maryland Climate Change Commission report recommendations, plus the science section. So try to focus, this part of the work on with that in mind. Any other comments on this topic? Okay. Well, let's move on to the next topic on the agenda, and this is really a continuation of the conversation we had towards the end of last year on priorities for 2025, and just given the discussion on methane and the discussion of energy, those probably those two. Although the methane is kind of half baked, right? We might be able to finish baking it quickly, but certainly this piece with energy and emissions and sources, it's a very, very interesting topic in itself. So this might be an area that we focus on. But we talked about other ideas towards last year, and I wanted to kind of retake that conversation, and I'll share a few slides that is a template that the commission provided for us to share those priorities. And let me show you this. I want to share my screen, and I'll walk you through this, and then we can have a little bit of a conversation around this. So, I need to send a request to share my screen. Is that who's host?
I think I did it. I think I just try
Okay.
again.
Okay, good, great. So let me just put this up and then share my screen. Yeah. Give me a second. I have multiple screens. I'm always challenged as to where the slideshow is going to pop up, and then I have to share that screen. I don't know if you have that problem, but I certainly do. So it's you should be seeing.
We do. Yep.
Okay, great. Pulled it off. Anyway, it's a working draft, and so this is a template provided by the commission for working groups to submit their priorities, and we have submitted a working draft of this already because it was due in January, but certainly, we can prioritize a few things. So just a few slides. So these are three priorities that we had discussed towards the end of the year. And again, we can update those anytime, including based on today's conversation. But looking more closely at nitrous oxide as a source, additions to a nitrous oxide to the greenhouse gas inventory. It has been noted since to us that the Maryland greenhouse gas inventory currently tracks nitrous oxide emissions in the state. But essentially, the scope of this was to look more closely at nitrous oxide. The second priority was to update the comprehensive assessment of climate change impacts in Maryland, which was published back in 2008. That was a very comprehensive study. Is that due for an update? And that could be an interesting exercise to do. And then we talked a little bit about creating a scenario analysis for carbon net zero in Maryland for inspiration purposes, and let me just quickly spell out what the way, we have provided a little bit of detail around these three priorities. On the nitrous oxide, identified sources of nitrous oxide in agriculture, waste, and energy. Quantify the global warming potential over, a century, and then how can nitrous oxide reduction measures could impact Maryland residents, agriculture, and industry, and complementing this information that nitrous oxide is currently being tracked in the Maryland greenhouse gas inventory, and the link to that it's in the slide which I'll distribute. Then we started talking a little bit about this idea in our last meeting last year, and this was a great suggestion that our dear colleague Don Bosch made, and he led this study back 17 years ago now, if you can believe it. And this can be complemented with different findings that have happened since and across the state. So I'm sure that there's probably lots of information we can mine to develop an update or revamped version, whatever we want to call it, about this report. So this is a longer term effort. This is not something we're going to do this year, but we can probably start doing it this year. And then the carbon net zero analysis, net zero scenario analysis, and again, also building off past reports and past work, trying to become a little bit more granular into trying to look across sectors: transportation, energy, residential, agriculture, and others, exploring carbon offsets, timelines, milestones. So do a little bit more granular analysis. Again, this would also be a longer term effort. So these are some ideas, and of course, just today, we have talked about at least one other solid possibility, which is this energy and emissions issue. So I wanted to, open up the conversation. If we come up with ideas that we want to focus on, we can put them very quickly in this template and update our, what we've submitted to MDE. But I wanted to open a conversation in terms of priorities that we have. So let me pause there and open it up.
Well,
Can I make a
Fernando,
quick?
just on the first one, just responding to the ones you've reviewed, the first one, I think the idea there is that yes, it's included in the inventory, but it's based on general rules of thumb that were developed by EPA that you use, and it's not really measured in any way. And so I think the opportunity here is in the discussion ensued. Eric Davidson's talking about the international and global assessment that they did. So there may be some things building on that we could provide. So I think Eric's insights and would be really key to do that. But I don't think this is a major undertaking. I think it's with just a couple of people who are 2 or 3 people who are kind of into this could do a short report that basically gives a little bit more granularity, as the term was used, about what this means for Maryland. The second one on the assessment, as you say, it's not an insignificant undertaking, but since that was done, what you said 17 years ago, my God, hard to imagine. There have been like 2 or 3, at least 2 IPCC assessments and several national assessments that could be summarized, and updated that report. In addition to that, we need to be mindful that Maryland needs this kind of information because unfortunately, as we've seen, it looks like even Maryland, even U.S. participants in the IPCC are going to be prevented from participating now by the new administration. So we won't have an American scientist engaged in that. We might not, at least. And then secondly, there's probably not going to be there's going to be a fight over whether the next national assessment gets done or gets released. So having some knowledge that's really specific to Maryland, I think, could be valuable, particularly because we have an adaptation and response working group that could use that information. And I think in 17 years, I think the answer to the question, has climate changed in that 17 years? Yes, it has.
Good.
Regarding N2O, I just put it in the chat. I have been back and forth with Eric, and I was hoping he'd be able to make a presentation at this meeting, but he's in India through, I think, June.
Yeah.
And so, but he was willing to kind of, tape a PowerPoint, but obviously the important part is the discussion afterwards. And so we thought it would be best to just hold that until July.
Yeah, I agree that Eric is really the expert. I mean, I can tell you the atmospheric chemistry of N2O, but he's the one who understands what can you do with soils to mitigate N2O release into the atmosphere. It's not monitored. It's a little tricky because the natural background is huge and you have just tiny perturbations on top of a natural background. So the precision of the measurements has to be high. We will have some, at least some data from a year, thanks to the Department of Energy. That's starting a month ago.
I just want to chime in for a second because your suggestion that you help us think about the net zero pathway for the state is a really important one and a timely one. Years go quickly as really was just pointed out by the history of our work here, but we're about 4 years away from needing to produce the state's final plan to achieve net zero emissions by 2045. And the pathway that the Center for Global Sustainability mapped out for us using GCAM, basically constraining the model to say, what is the lowest cost pathway for Maryland to achieve net zero emissions? If you've looked at the plan, and thanks Don for putting a link to it in the chat, you see there's a substantial removal called for in the net zero pathway. And I think to me that raises this question of well, one, point blank, in what world would we be investing in Maryland that much money on CO2 removal technology that doesn't have a lot of co-benefit other than, pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere? And if the state were prepared to make that sort of investment, are those dollars best invested here? And that gets to a really big policy question of our boundaries for net zero emissions and whether or not we hold to the idea that our objective as a state, and this is our statutory requirement to produce plans and to work toward net zero greenhouse gas emissions, our statewide greenhouse gas emissions, which includes all of the emissions within the boundaries of our state, plus emissions from our electricity supply. If we continue to use those boundaries, we're fairly constrained in terms of where those investments would take place to reduce global emissions, right? I think the scientific primarily conversation around what is the most reasonable approach has really, really significant policy implications for the state to think about what are the boundaries we actually intend to use as we wholeheartedly intend to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. But the constraints of that definition alone determines where our plan says investments will be made.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Did I hear you say something about co-benefits of greenhouse gas reductions?
I was just making the point that if the model is right and we make a lot of investments to help, electrify transportation sector, electrify buildings, generate electricity from clean sources, so on and so forth, the model still says it instead of squeezing the last remaining emissions out of our economy, it would be lower cost to build and deploy CO2 removal technologies to draw down the rest of the CO2 from the atmosphere for statewide greenhouse gas emissions to reach net zero by 2045.
Mm-hmm.
And my point there on co-benefits, we think a lot about the co-benefits of our policies, but the point I was making there is that if that is meant to be a CO2 removal technology that is serving the purpose of, and probably consuming a lot of electricity to serve this purpose of just pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, that is, I think that the co-benefits of that, I mean, certainly valuable climate benefits, right? Obvious to all of us, but probably lower on the co-benefit scale than other investments that the state could be making, right? So that was the only point I was trying to make on co-benefits in that case.
Okay, I get you. Sure, I mean the co-benefits of replacing diesel trucks with electric trucks are enormous. I mean, that's economically that's the main argument. It's the lives saved. Okay, but you're right. Yeah, just sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, that's tough one. And the last little smidgen, we may have to do that in order to get to true net zero. These are certainly points I would agree with. So thank you. Yeah, I think that. Thanks for the report, Don. We need
Yeah,
to
as Mark pointed out, as Mark pointed out, it's more than a smidgen. Look at that graph to show you that the increase in the negative emissions that we have to achieve by the
it is a daunting goal. If that's your point, I'm fully on board with it. And yeah, sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere is going to cost energy and money.
No, I think the question maybe for this group, in addition to following Don's suggestion, read it, there'll be a quiz, et cetera. Is there value added from this group spending some time, digesting and offering additional commentary on the recommendations of that report so that we can distill recommendations for the MCCC report later this year? I mean, is that a valuable contribution? Is that a priority? Is net zero high on the agenda that we can contribute to?
I think so. I think so, Fernando. If you put it together with Mark's observation that in 4 years they're going to have to develop the plan. This plan really gets us to the 2031 goal, right? So they need to do a plan to get us to the 2045 goal. And so if we're thinking of this plan, okay, how do we build on this and how do we get to that next step? I think that's where it could help the effort that they're going to have to do over the next 4 years. Have I got that right from what you said, Mark?
That's right. And actually, once we start piecing out the requirement of the law is essentially in 2029, we've got to have the state's final net zero plan. If there were any additional direction that MDE would need to consider in the development of that plan, then that would have to happen legislatively, ideally well in advance, right? So, I mean, the window really for statutory changes to inform an alternative approach, perhaps, to what it means to achieve net zero emissions. The window for that in terms of legislation is probably in the next couple of years to give us the direction needed to write the final plan and to set up the modeling to support, the statutory requirements of the plan.
Okay. Okay. So that makes sense. So we can edit, modify that area, that priority to kind of align with this goal and what you're saying. And given that we have time, it is a longer time proposition, I think. Okay, good. Wonderful. Any other comments? We're 50 minutes out, and we do have space in the agenda for public comment, and so if there's no further discussion on the agenda topics, I want to open up that part of the meeting for public comment. Yes, Jeff Silva.
Yeah, thank you very much. I believe you're all doing exceptional work in grappling the scope of the problem. I know as scientists, you go out and you're stuck with having to take a look at a problem or a phenomena and try to come up with valid observations and then come up with formulas and predict results, from which the engineers take that and then they block off all there and limit the boundary of a problem in order to solve it. So you folks have a most difficult task, and I want to compliment you on the breadth of the discussion that I've witnessed today. Thanks again. Good luck, and I'm proud to live in Maryland because of your efforts.
Thank you. We're happy to make you proud, and I think we're all happy to be in Maryland these days. So we share the sentiment. Anything else?
Fernando, if I could just take a moment.
Please.
We have you guys have seen various science to policy fellows help with the STWG, which helps me and Fernando and any chair enormously. We have a new one that'll be starting in March. She happens to be finishing her PhD at College Park, Rahat Sarif. And I'll be introducing her to the STWG after she begins. And so, look out for emails from her that would still be going to the all, STWG email list in the future. So I'm sorry some of these meetings have been a little bit shotgun in terms of getting the agendas and so forth. Hopefully with the addition of Rahat, we'll be a little bit more organized prior to the meetings themselves. So.
Yes. certainly looking forward to getting a little bit more muscle, helping run and manage this great group, and apologize for having to cancel the January meeting. In that week in January, I think for most academic institutions around the country, the oxygen was taken out of the room. And we were dealing with a lot of stuff, and it's just unfathomable. I think we're starting to feel that we're catching our breaths now, slowly. So bear with us, and I appreciate everybody's contribution to this, and look forward to next conversations.
I think we've just turned on our anoxic metabolism.
Yes. But